Good afternoon and welcome to our friends in Mexico and to those joining us also from Canada. And good morning to those that are our colleagues here in Australia. Welcome to the Australian Canola Mexico webinar, Opportunities for Mexico's Oilseed Crushing Industry with the Australian Canola. My name is Mary Rains. I'm the Markets Manager for AGIC, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, and I am your host MC for today. It's a real pleasure to have so many people interested in the Australian canola industry, in the canola meal industry and oilseeds. We've got a very big program for you today. But before I launch into the program, just a little bit of housekeeping. This program, this webinar is simultaneously translated. So you can listen to this webinar in your preferred language, be that Spanish or English. So select down the bottom of the icon bar on Zoom, you'll see a translation. If you just tap on the circle translation and select English or Spanish, then you can listen to us in your preferred language. Excellent. As I said, we do have a big program. We have a lot of representatives here from the Australian grains industry. So we're going to hold all questions over to the Q&A section in this webinar. We have received a fair few questions that have come in through the registrations. And in our past experience with our webinars with Mexico and Colombia, they're very dynamic. So just put your question into the Q&A and we'll come to that in the Q&A section. So, and then at the end of this webinar, there is a poll survey just to provide some evaluation on how you rated this webinar for you as consumers of canola and canola meal. This survey is to provide us feedback so that we can ensure that we provide insights and information that where you gain value out of it. Okay, so the administration part is done. As I said, this is a big program today, and I'm very pleased to be with you here. And I'm very grateful that you've taken the opportunity out of your busy work day to join us. This webinar has been put on by and is in collaboration with a lot of the industry bodies here in Australia, including the Australian Oilseed Federation, Grain Trade Australia. Also, we have been working, joining us and supporting this event is also GRDC, the Grains Research Development Corporation, and DAF, the Department of Agricultural, Fisheries and Forestries through ACMAC funding. Okay, I'd just like to introduce everybody that will be speaking in today's webinar. The first speaker in the program is actually myself, Mary Rains. So I have been worked with AGIC for the last 6 years. I have over 20 years experience within the Australian grains industry supply chain, from production through to end users and consumers, market engagement and market development. My presentation today will be about what is the value to Mexico's canola meal industry with Australian canola. Following my presentation, I'd like to welcome back to your screen will be Mr. Pat O'Shaughnessy. Mr. Pat O'Shaughnessy, great to have you with us. I think we last saw you in 2021 for the canola industry. Pat is the CEO of Grain Trade Australia. Grain Trade Australia is an peak industry body representing all the grain trading, or 95% of the grain traders here in Australia. Pat's background, he has a diverse industry experience, having spent more than 20 years in the grains industry, both here in Australia and also in the USA. Pat has a depth of first-hand experience across the entire value chain, with roles include of management, grain organisation, trading, trade policy, business strategy, and this is all gained from working in trading houses and financial institutions, as well as customer service. It's great to have you with us, Pat. Pat's presentation is Grain Australia Update, Quality Assurance to Capture Value by Connecting with Trade, Access, Supply and Demand. Thanks, Mr. Pat O'Shaughnessy. Great to have you back. Following Pat's presentation, I'd like to welcome to your screen a face that you would have seen before, and that is Mr. Nick Goddard. He is the CEO of the Australian Oilseeds Federation here, and also AOF, and also the CEO of Pulse Australia. Both organisations are whole of value chain bodies representing the respective industries, both locally and internationally. Bit of background about Nick. Nick has a long and successful career in the Australian food industry, working with the end user proportions of agriculture value chain with global multinational organisations. We're really pleased that Nick could join us again, and his presentation will be on overview of the Australian grain harvest from 2022 and what the value is for imports of canola, canola meal and oil. Thank you, Nick Goddard. Following Nick's presentation, we have another speaker for you. And that is, I'd like to welcome to the screen Dr. Tanya Oliver. She's the newly appointed Councillor for Agriculture with the Australian Government based in the Australian Embassy in Mexico City. It's great to have you here, Tanya. You're very vibrant, you've been very passionate, you've been driving a lot of the work in the background to host this webinar. So a little bit about Dr. Tanya. Her responsibilities include all related activities for the Australia agricultural industry in Mexico, Central America, Colombia, and the Caribbean. As I said, Dr. Tanya is with the department, is with the Australian Government, based in Mexico City at the Australian Embassy. And her presentation today is on the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry regulation of the grains industry and export of canola supporting trade to Mexico. It's really terrific to have you with us again, Dr. Tanya. Following Dr. Tanya's presentation, we will roll into the Q&A section. And I'd like to bring to your screen Mrs. Rosemary Richards. Rosemary Richards is the chair of the Australian Oilseeds Federation, and she will be emceeing the Q&A panel today. So please ensure that you put a lot of questions into Rosemary. Rosemary is the principal of Bowen Richards and Associates, BR&A, a consulting firm specialising in providing strategic support to agribusiness firms here in Australia. Rosemary also has extensive experience in biotechnology sector, including regulatory frameworks, impact evaluation and advocacy. Rosemary is, as I said, is deputy chair, is chair of the Australian Oilseeds Federation and is also deputy chair of the Cotton Research and Development Corporation here in Australia. She also is a representative board director on the Sugar Research Australia and recently been appointed to the Grains Australia Grain Market Access Council. Welcome, Mrs. Rosemary Richards, to our webinar today. Following the Q&A section, we'll hear from the Australian trade organisation called Austrade with Mr. Craig Ford, who will be providing the closing comments for the webinar. Austrade, the Australian Trade Investment Commission, is based also at Mexico City at the Australian Embassy. And following, I'd like to provide and welcome to your screen Miss Patricia Holmes. Miss Patricia Holmes is Head of Missions of Trades from Australia into Mexico. She's based at the Australian Embassy in Mexico City. She's a charge d'affaires. So a little bit about Patricia Holmes. Immediately, she's just been recently appointed to this position as of last month. So congratulations on your appointment, Patricia. A little bit of background about Patricia is she was, prior to this assignment, she was the Assistant Secretary to Trade and Investment Strategies Branch in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade with the Australian Government. Until 2022, Ms. Holmes was the Deputy Permanent Representative of Australia to the World Trade Organization. So I'd like to now hand over to you, to Patricia Holmes, to provide the official welcoming to this webinar. Thank you, Patricia. Great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Mary. I hope you can hear me. And muy buenas tardes todos y todas en Mexico y Colombia. And good morning to those joining from Australia. As mentioned, my name's Patricia Holmes. I'm Charge d'Affaires at the Australian Embassy in Mexico. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar organised by the Australian Grain Export Innovation Centre and our embassy in Mexico. The agricultural relationship between our countries is strong and growing. We have been collaborating on some important biosecurity issues and growing agricultural trade. With Mexico, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, FTA, has created a range of opportunities for both countries to expand market access and to diversify our trade. And I was very pleased to see that in 2022, Australian canola began exporting to Mexico to help meet the requirements of the Mexican oilseed crushing industry. Exploiting the synergies between our markets and finding new market opportunities keeps both our economies growing. Mexico's imports of low erucic acid canola seeds from Australia went from previously non-existent to Australian dollars 56 million in 2022, moving to the 7th largest importer of Australian canola seeds out of a total of 27 importing countries. At the previous webinar in 2021, we heard an overview from the Australian canola industry and how quality assurance of Australian grains is maintained. And as we've heard at today's webinar, we'll outline the value that Australian canola seeds can add to Mexico's canola meal industry, how to capture that value by connecting with trade supply and demand, and provide an update on Australia's grain harvest from the 2022 season. And it's really great to see the benefits both to Mexican producers and manufacturers and Australian producers that can come from this cooperation. So I hand back now to Miss Mary Rains from AGIC for her presentation. And I really thank you all and wish you all the best in this promotion. Thanks, Mary.
Lovely. Thank you, Patricia. Again, welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you here this afternoon in Mexico City. My presentation is about what is the value to Mexico's canola meal industry with Australian canola from an AGIC perspective. And I just will move there we go. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of IT issues with my screen. Okay. Sean, will you be able to take over, please? Thank you. Okay, so just a little bit of background into AGIC, the Australian Export Grain. This presentation will give you a background into AGIC, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, an overview of the Australian grains industry and the value and opportunities to customers using Australian grain and Australian canola. So when we look at Australia and who AGIC is an independent non-for-profit company. We are industry good. We have investment from the Australian government and the Australian grain growers through GRDC, the Grains Research Development Corporation. We're a national organisation and we have research laboratories both in Perth and in Sydney. We were established in 2012 to increase the value of Australian grains industry to our customers across all grain crops, be that wheat, canola, barley, oats, pulses, and to a lesser degree, sorghum. So we lead the technical market engagement aspects and we look to work to add value to customers of Australians' grain. Now, how we do that, AGIC's operating model. If you look at the top right, we look to learn about our markets from our customers and consumers. We do a lot of engagement activities. We present technical information about the Australian grains industry specific to the end user and the consumer. We work with those consumers and customers to understand the information that they require, what obstacles they are faced and challenged with when purchasing Australian grain. We bring all that information back into Australia. We ground truth it with technical research, laboratory testing, and then if you look at, then we develop evidence and applied solutions to respond to our market's insights and to our customers of Australian grain, be that with wheat for noodles, wheat for bread, barley for beer, barley for feed grains, but also then for canola use in feed grains as well. And we take those solutions, we apply that back and share that with our customers and provide the market insights from our domestic Australian industry with our stakeholders and customers in market. So we operate in that sharing of technical information and applied solutions. So a little bit about the value of the Australian opportunities using Australian grain. We look, when you look at Australia, we're just under 4,000 kilometres east-west. This map up here of Australia, where the area is shaded blue, is where grain is grown in Australia. We plant over 24 million hectares of winter grain crops annually. In Australia, they're planted in April and May, and then we harvest in our summer months of November, December. Being a large country, we have diverse soil types, climatic conditions, farming systems, and markets. Over 95% of the grain crops grown here in Australia are reliant on rainfall. So there's less than 5% of our grain crops are actually irrigated. On the map of Australia, I've just pointed out where our export ports are. When you look at the Australian grains industry and what AGIC does, and we work along all the supply chain, you'll hear today from Grain Trade Australia. We collaborate with Grain Trade Australia so that there's that effective support into market. We have GRDC, which is the Grains Research Corporation, the peak industry body for agricultural research. We work along the Australian oilseeds and Australian Federation of Oilseeds with the Australian Canola, Grains Australia and Pulse Australia. The beauty about the Australian grains industry, which you'll hear from Pat O'Shannessy later on, is that we're a highly regulated and organised country, and we work with all our commercial companies such as Pioneers, BASF, Newseeds, Seednet and Bayer within the Australian oilseeds industry. Some of our work, a lot of our work actually is supported through the Australian government, like today's webinar, and that's through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We also have the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestries, and also Austrade, where we do a lot of collaboration to ensure that our customers in market, be that in Mexico, Colombia, and Central America, are fully supported in the information that they receive from the Australian grains industry. Australian grain industry does have a lot of quality attributes and strengths. So we work to ensure that quality assurance, and you'll hear more about that, where we ensure that we have dry food and safe feed grain for marketing. We have variety purity in terms across our supply chain. Our grain is clean. You'll hear from later on today, Nick Goddard, who will talk to you about the international sustainability of carbon certification schemes here in Australia to ensure that our purchasers are aware what we are doing in that sustainability space. One thing that Australia does very well is also produce accurate crop updates, and that's led by the Australian government. So that's benefited to everybody here in Australia and also internationally. And another thing that AGIC does is that we're actually invested and engaged to add value to Mexico and Colombia in the canola space. When you look at grain, and I'll only talk about this very shortly, like Australia has come off the third largest grain production year. We've produced just under 70 million tonnes of grain in 2022-2023. And out of that, canola makes up around 11% of our grain market. And when you compare canola and our oilseeds industry, canola is just under 8,000 tonnes is produced, and compared to our cottonseed industry, which makes up 12% of our market. When we look at what AGIC does with the production in terms of our technical market engagement activities, we host a lot and lead a lot of technical aspects in terms of how customers can gain value out of using and incorporating grain into their feed rations. We've led over 28 webinars over the last 12 months regarding Australian feed grains into various livestock industries across various countries that are purchasing Australian grain. We look to do a lot of in-market activities now around the Australian feed grains aspect and ensuring that people that and customers that are using Australian grain, that they optimise their value in incorporating Australian grains into their rations. We have done some work and we can see that there is work and value using Australian feed grains into Mexico. We know that if you're using canola meal in the Mexico feed industry, it provides a well-balanced source of ruminant degradable proteins and digestible undegradable proteins. Using canola meal can replace soybean meal in the dairy cow and the poultry diets with positive responses. And we know that it also can provide better balance of amino acids for milk protein synthesizers than soybeans can in the dairy industry when you incorporate canola meal into the rations. It can stimulate daily feed intakes for increased milk productions. We know that also using canola meal for Mexico's feed industry, particularly into the dairy industry, is a good phosphorus source, and it may be used as a primary protein supplement in lactating cows and transitioning cows from calf to diet. So there is that technical support for this sort of activity to take place with consumers of canola meal. So just in finishing in my presentation, AGIC does offer that technical support to customers of Australian grains. When we incorporate that further technical support, it actually deepens the value proposition of to our customers. We build that trust and rapport. As I mentioned, Australia is a large producer of grain. This year we produced just under 70 million metric tonnes of grain that will be predominantly exported overseas. We do work to have that strong volumes of high quality food and feed grains. Australia is a credible Australian grains. We do provide those credible Australian grain industry updates that come out quarterly that talk about the area of grain produced and the estimated yields and production. And the Australian grains industry offers a whole of industry approach to support our customers. And you'll feel that vibe and you'll gain insights into that through today's webinar. So thank you very much for your time. And now I would like to hand over to Mr. Pat O'Shannessy.
Thanks, Mary, and good morning to everyone. Just wait for the PowerPoint to fire. Okay. Well, thanks everyone, and good morning. I'm saying good morning because I'm here in Sydney, Australia, so it is the morning, and good afternoon. Good have a good evening wherever you are. So I'm Pat O'Shannessy from Grain Trade Australia, and I'll just briefly explain a little bit about Grain Trade Australia and who we are. We're a member-driven organisation. Our members are basically the supply chain managers and the grain exporters out of Australia. So the grain, the canola that you're buying out of Australia will be from a GTA member. What we do in Australia is effectively provide the industry with what we would call a self-regulatory framework. So we're providing trading standards. We work with Australian Oilseed Federation on canola standards, a standard set of contracts and trade rules across industry. We run an arbitration service for when contracts perhaps don't go the way that people wanted them to go, and then do a lot of work in trade market access policy areas and provide industry with some stewardship through training programs and also through a code of practice, which I'll talk a bit more about in a couple of moments. So Grain Trade Australia, what I mentioned, we have standard form contracts and trade rules. The key thing about that, I think, is that what you'll find in dealing with the Australian industry is the practices, the contractual arrangements, and the execution of a contract will be very much standardised from one buyer to the next buyer. So that facilitates trade, and that makes it easier for trade, easier for customers, easier for consumers to understand how the contracts will be executed out of Australia. We have contracts at various different points in the supply chain, but at the FOB point, we have what we call a number one contract that provides a standard set of terms and conditions. And then you'll find that each trader will then perhaps include some additional terms and conditions over and above the standard Grain Trade Australia terms. So that's effectively the way that system works, and that facilitates trade and helps with our exports there as well. Now, I mentioned before the Australian Grains Industry Code of Practice, and you'll see here the picture. This is a little booklet that we have. And what this document does is it outlines the processes, the procedures, the expectations, if you like, of how to manage grain through the Australian grain supply chain. It is endorsed by the Australian Department of Agriculture and looks at areas around production, harvesting, sampling, storing grain, chemical use, commercial storage, marketing, contracting, and trade rules. So every Grain Trade Australia member adheres to the Australian Grains Industry Code of Practice that outlines how grain is managed through our supply chain. So it really underpins the quality grain that you can get out of Australia. Within the Code of Practice, we have some further technical guideline documents, we call, but these are very much detailed documents about how to manage grain. So there's a couple of here that I just wanted to point out. One was about sampling grain and making sure that when you're trading grain, canola, making sure that what you are looking at is a representative sample of, be it a truck or a consignment or even a shipload of grain. So very important. What I would sort of suggest, if you don't have a representative sample of what you're trading, then the rest is going to be wrong. So very important to make sure that we focus on making sure we have representative samples. And then for those that are in the container side of the business, we have quite an extensive document actually about what constitutes a food grade quality container, food grade container. And so we have this empty shipping container inspection guide that has been produced in conjunction with the Australian government and Shipping Australia around what is a food grade container. That document is about 80 pages long and has a lot of pictures of what's good and what's bad in terms of containers, and making sure we make sure we maintain our quality product there. We do focus in Australia around modernising the grain supply chain, and we've conducted a program there and a number of projects in that area for a number of years, and GTA will focus very much there about making sure that we modernise the supply chain. The simple premise of that really is saying is if you can improve the efficiency of your supply chain, you're going to add value to every single tonne that goes through that supply chain, and that value will go back to the consumer and also back to the producer as well. Now, Australian grain, there's a few inherent characteristics here, and this I think stands whether you're looking at canola, wheat, barley, sorghum, any of the Australian grains, basically produced in an environment that delivers you a low moisture, a very safe product, clean and functional product. And I know Nick Goddard will talk a bit more about the functionality around canola, but the environment, the safe product of Australian grain, a lot of it does come back to the environment and also the technology and the farming systems that are used across industry. I'd say a little bit more about that. So that's the inherent quality there, but also when working in the industry and trading and securing and procuring grain, there's other things to think about too around the product, the contract, as I said, the contract and the trade rules, reliable counterparties, making sure that you're dealing with people that will actually deliver on what they say, and then also focusing on the quality assurance processes there, because in today's world, quality assurance and food safety are becoming more and more important factors. Now, in the supply chain through Australia, there's a little bit of a picture here to try and follow that through. But the first point I'd like to make and try and be very clear about it is every single truckload of grain, every single truckload of canola that comes off a farm in Australia that goes into our supply chain is sampled and tested. So every single truckload. And then the grain is also sampled and tested as it moves through the chain, through commercial storages up country, as we would call it, and down to the ports, the export ports that Mary showed you a picture there before on the coastal fringes where we have our export terminals. So sampling, testing, and that's a process there, working with farmers, with government, and also our supply chain managers and transporters working through there. So just focusing a little bit more around here, around the processes. So we have industry stewardship through codes of practices. Our system very much, I'll talk a little bit more, but very much Australia is a country of exporters, so very much conscious about the global system, global facing system, and having the industry there focusing very much based on science and risk, and making sure that we manage those risks through the supply chain. Our system, our producers are not subsidised, so we're very much focused around the market driven, and then also in terms of the contractual side of things, as I said, standard form contracts that are actually underpinned by contractual law, fair trading legislation in Australia, as well as a number of other commercial trading systems. The role of government in Australia, the Australian system, is a little bit different, I think, to many other parts of the world. We have this industry-driven self-regulatory framework that I mentioned earlier, and then the government are involved in terms of making sure that the export establishments are registered and meet the criteria, and then government will inspect the grain at the point of export to make sure it is free of live pests and insects, and also meets the importing country requirements. Now, I mentioned before, some of the things about Australian grain, the low moisture, the quality, the safety around that. And what I really want to, I guess, when we wrap all that up, is we sort of say, in our industry, whether you're buying or selling, I suppose, price is important, and very much important, and you've got to have a good price to transact there. But then think about the value of what you're actually buying, and that's around quality. So if you're buying low moisture canola, you're getting more canola per tonne than if you're buying a higher moisture product, for example. That's pretty simple. So there's value in that. Value in the reliability around the supply chain and the counterparties that you're dealing with. I think if you're running a processing facility, probably the first rule of business is don't run out of supply. So make sure that you're dealing with counterparties and a system that can deliver you the product when you need it, where you need it. And then the safety part of the product there. And these days, safety is also in terms of occupational health and safety, compliance with regulations, and making sure we're understanding those things. There's value in all of that, value in what you call yield, extraction, and consistency of a product through a consignment. There's value in all of that there as well. So also, price is important, but really think about the value of the product that you're actually getting. And we've done some examples, and we can see some examples there. Think about the actual price of the end product that you're trying to produce, not necessarily the price of the grain that you're buying at the front end of the transaction. The Australian grains industry at a glance, and Mary's run through some of these points here, but I guess a couple of points I'd like to make there. And we say we're producing around 65, 67 million tonnes of grain. But I'd point you to the chart at the top right there. And really what the point is here is that the Australian farmer over the last 10 years has raised the bar of average production in Australia. And that's through a number of things. It's through science, research, innovation, improved farming systems, low-till cropping. Effectively, our farmers are producing more grain per millimetre of rain in Australia over the last 10 or 15 years. And we're seeing that in the increased value of our industry, and also that then reflects through to the increased volumes of exports. So our main exports out of Australia, our main grains that we produce, wheat, barley and canola are the top three. Sorghum as a feed grain is also produced up in northern New South Wales and Queensland and exported around the world. And then, of course, we also produce some pulses and have those exported into countries such as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh as well. So that's the profile of Australian grain. The other point would like to make is that on our chart here, we look back on the left-hand side here and we see back in 1989-90, that is, Australia consumed around 7 million tonnes of grain domestically. And we get to today and we've consumed up to 18 million tonnes of grain. So that's been a huge growth in domestic consumption in Australia. And that's been attributed to a number of things: an increase in population, increase in feeding grain, and an increase in our livestock sector as well, beef, chicken, and pigs. But the key point to understand in Australia is that we are a country of exporters. Around 60 to 70% of what we produce will be exported to the world. So global markets, rules-based trading, certainty in trade is fundamental to the success of our industry, and that's why we engage so collaboratively and focus very much on our destination markets and our customers there. You can see we export to around about 80 to 90, close to 100 different countries in any given year. So again, as I point out, our markets and our customers and our destinations are just so critical to the success and the viability of our industry. Now, one thing in terms of our exporting, around about 10-12% of our national exports go out of our country in containers, but on our east coast, around Victoria, New South Wales, so if you think about where Sydney and Melbourne are, around about 30 up to sort of 40-50% of those exports can go out in containers. And I think there's a niche there in containers around, it depends on the freight, but also in terms of establishing a market. You can work with a smaller amount of product, understand the product, and then build that business over time. There's lower capital costs, some logistics issues perhaps make it a bit simpler at times, and then also work around developing niche opportunities there as well. So the container export are quite a significant section of our export industry as well, and a great way of growing and developing markets as over time. Now, we're living in a world today where environment, social, governance, ESG issues are becoming more and more prominent and more front and center, as we would say, around the globe in terms of the product that we're dealing with. So what we would say here in Australia is that we're focusing very much around the sustainability angle of that as well. Now, we've done some work, and this work has been done by some of our industry counterparts around focusing in on our customers and our markets when it comes to ESG, environment, social, governance issues. And what we've basically identified through some survey work and with customers is saying to the customers, what's most important to you, the customer, about the product that you're buying out of Australia and out of any countries. And really, the message come back quite clearly is it's about food safety, chemical residues, traceability, which is food safety as well, and nutrition, which is quality, again, as those key areas. So as I hope you can sort of see that we in those areas, we think that Australia has a very, we can deliver on all of those concerns around that customers may have around chemical residues, traceability, and of course the quality of the product. We've also identified some other areas that focusing in on sustainability, and believe that the industry has quite a lot of the credentials of the industry, are quite sound in this area. So whether you're looking here, this is just a diagrammatic representation around these issues: food safety, traceability, sustainability, people and their safety, nutrition and integrity around that. And we can, as you drill down to those things, look at what the industry has in place and how it delivers on these concerns. As an example, integrity, we get back to the standard contracting systems and the rule of law. People and safety, we have occupational health and safety regulations. Food safety, we have a very strong regulatory regime, the National Residue Survey in Australia, managing to make sure that our products and our chemical residues are all within the limits that are required in our destination countries, and also through our own regulatory framework in Australia as well. Now, as I mentioned, Australia is a country of exporters, and we believe very much in a rules-based international framework for trade. And we believe that supports trade, that supports food security around the world, and also is conducive and constructive for all, for both consumers and producers in trade. Australia is an active part, and GTA is an active part of a group called the International Grain Trade Coalition. And I'd like to say hello to my friend Ricardo from Apomex, who's also an active member of IGTC, International Grain Trade Coalition. It's a coalition of organisations and commercial players that have the same concerns around trade, and we've developed policy positions on these issues. And when you see an IGTC issue a policy position, it's a position of strength because of the consensus behind that position in there. So IGTC will have active membership across the globe: South America, Mexico, Brazil, North America, Canada, Australia, Europe, UK, China, just to name a few countries there around that. But the key, the value that's being driven there is pushing at an international level for free trade based on rules, based on science, and around risk frameworks. So very much supporting trade there, and we believe that facilitates trade and improves global food security as well. Now, just to finish up here, what I would guess is around confidence is the point that I'd like to make here. There's no market without confidence. If you don't have confidence in a product, don't have confidence in your counterparties, you're not going to trade it. So what I would suggest here is around when you first buy a product, you're testing it, you're trying to understand it, you want to see what it's like. You buy it again, you understand it, you're sort of going, oh yeah, now I'm understanding what I'm getting. You get to this point called reliability. You're starting to have an expectation of what's going to be delivered. Then as you get more and more down that track, the product's developing a reputation, the product and the people that you're dealing with, there's a reputation, there's an expectation. And finally, you get to that point where you really have confidence in that product. You're going to buy more of it. And that's where there's real value in that for the consumer, around having confidence in the product and knowing what you're buying, what you're getting is going to be delivered on. So that's value. That's value. Having confidence in your product, and we really hope that that will develop through the Australian canola and any other grains that we can talk to with Mexico about that. So thank you very much for your time this morning and this afternoon. And I'll now hand over to Nick Goddard from the Australian Oilseeds Federation. Thank you.
I think Nick's on mute. Can you unmute Nick?
My camera's not working either. Okay. Well, thank you, Pat, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just having some trouble, I think, with my video here, but anyway, hopefully you can hear me all okay. So I'm Nick Goddard. I'm the CEO of the Australian Oilseeds Federation, I'll just rest the slides. So the Australian Oilseeds Federation is the peak industry body for the Australian oilseeds industry, which covers all the oilseeds produced in Australia: sunflower, soybean, safflower, linseed, and particularly canola, which is the predominant oilseed produced. The organisation's been going for over 53 years now, and it comes together to bring the industry together. It provides the linkages throughout the value chain, from the breeders through to the end users and the food manufacturers. We take a whole of industry approach when we undertake investment work to ensure that the work that is undertaken is prepared and done for the benefit of the whole industry. And we are an independent, non-government based organisation, providing that independent voice to government. So just to look at canola production in Australia, and Mary touched on this a little earlier, but we have two basic cropping systems in Australia, the summer and the winter cropping system. And we are predominantly a winter cropping system. So at this time of the year in May, we're just heading into our season, and sowing is just getting underway. So around 23 million hectares is sown for winter crops each year. And canola is about 12% of that. This is from last year, 2022. You can see we're predominantly a wheat producer, but barley and canola and pulses, as have been covered before. The area shaded in green in this picture here indicates the area which is the predominant winter cropping belt, and much of that area includes area that would be taken up with canola. Obviously, we're in the Southern Hemisphere, so we have a different seasonal planting arrangements to the Northern Hemisphere, and particularly when we look at canola and compare ourselves with Canada. Because we're growing in winter, we have different types of varieties that grow as opposed to the Northern Hemisphere crops that grow in summer, and yet we plant and have a similar monthly spread. So we sow around now, April, May. The plant grows throughout winter and is harvested as coming into summer. And that's obviously the inverse to what happens with Canada, where they sow coming into summer and they harvest as winter approaches. And you can see there, just for what it's worth, the difference in that we have much shorter days during winter. So the crop is in the ground for longer in Australia. I've just listed there some of the variations between some of our major growing area of Wagga Wagga in New South Wales compared with, say, Saskatoon in Canada, and the different amount of sunlight hours we receive during the peak of the growing period. The Australian canola industry is around $5.5 billion US. And you can see there the trajectory of growth that we have experienced over particularly the last few years, but in a longer term trend since the late 2000s. The Australian winter cropping area, and particularly canola, is heavily influenced by the seasonal conditions. And you'd be familiar with the El Nino and La Nina weather conditions that impact the Pacific Ocean. And we have the inverse situation to those in South America and Mexico. So when we have El Nino conditions, it tends to be drier, warmer conditions. And when we have La Nina, we tend to have wetter conditions. And you can see here how in this chart, how the crop production responds to those seasonal conditions. And we have just come to the end of a 3-year run of La Nina, which has really pushed the Australian canola production up towards 8 million tonnes, which has been an absolute record for last year. Typically, though, if we draw a line through that, we produce around 4 to 5 million tonnes of canola per annum. 2021, we did around 5, and as I just mentioned, 2022, we did closer to 8 million tonnes. Similar with all the Australian grain production, the canola production is highly dependent on exports, and domestic consumption is around 1.3 million tonnes of canola. Anything in excess of that is exported. And as you can see from the chart at the bottom of the page, we have for many, many years now have a strong and growing exportable surplus. So supply is consistent. We are the number 2 global exporter of canola after Canada. If we look at who our major markets are, destination markets for Australian canola, we're heavily reliant on the European Union, taking more than 2/3 of the Australian canola production, and then followed by markets such as Japan, China, the United Emirates, and Bangladesh. So that's a snapshot of how our trade has been for the 5 years up to last year. Fairly consistent and steady, but we certainly would like to see Mexico as a coloured wedge within that pie chart. Looking at quality Australian canola, we produce each year a summary of the quality of the Australian canola. This publication is made available on request. It details the key quality attributes for Australian canola for that particular season. The last season, 2022 season, the results are just being compiled. That publication will be available shortly. But if we look at the 2021 publication, I've just outlined some of the key metrics of the quality of Australian canola here. We averaged across the country an average oil content of 47%, very strong oil content level. Obviously, in contrast to that, the protein level is down. So when we have good years, we tend to have high, when I say good years, good seasonal conditions, we have a high oil content and tends to be lower protein. And when we have the drier years, El Nino years, we tend to have slightly lower oil and higher protein contents. Our glucosinolate levels remain well and truly within the bounds of as required for canola. And we have a test weight in this particular year of 66 kilograms per hectolitre. Iodine value of 116 and very low chlorophyll levels, 5 milligrams per kilogram. Bearing in mind, as I mentioned before, the Australian canola crop is harvested coming into summer. So therefore, some of these metrics are quite different to the Northern Hemisphere comparisons, particularly when we look at moisture. So we have a delivery moisture maximum of 8%, but typically it's around 5% moisture. And to echo the comments made by my colleague Pat, the lower the moisture means that for every tonne of seed you're purchasing more oil and less water. If we just look at that oil content, I said it was 47% in 2021, and we can see here how that varies over the years. But through extensive breeding and good agronomy, we are managing to maintain good oil content levels over the most recent years of around 45% or above, which has been very good. We also have both GM and non-GM canola in Australia, and we are unique in many parts compared to many parts of the world in that we're able to segregate both the GM and non-GM components of within the supply chain. So last year we looked at around a quarter of the total canola crop was genetically modified. This is a growing portion of the Australian crop, but it does remain segregated. So one of the opportunities we have and the benefits that Australia can provide is a very clear supply chain of non-GM for those markets where that is important. Another aspect that differentiates Australian canola is its sustainability credentials. So many of you would be familiar with these global companies presented on this chart, and all these companies have got strong sustainability commitments that they've made to their shareholders, to their customers, and to their other stakeholders. and they are pushing those sustainability credentials back down the supply chain towards their agricultural inputs, and that obviously includes grain products and oilseeds such as canola. So we are seeing increasingly global companies like Mars, like Unilever, starting to require sustainability credentials down the supply chain to for the canola oil that they are purchasing. So what do we mean by sustainability? So what we're talking about is grain that is produced to achievable standards, grain that is produced by internationally recognized sustainability standards, and grain that is produced by standards that are accepted by the industry. And that's very important, that the food industry and the feed industry and the brewing industry, the beer industry, can accept the standards that are that we apply. So Australia has adopted the ISCC, the German scheme, for its certifying its Australian grain. And if we look at just the year just gone, 2022, we had over 5,000 Australian grain farms that were certified as ISCC sustainable, meaning that any of the production of grain, particularly canola, coming out of any of those farms is certified according to ISCC standards. In total, we had a little over 4 million tonnes of grain certified as sustainable last year. That's covering predominantly canola, but also covers barley and oats. I understand that Mexico is a buyer of Australian oats, and those oats are certified as sustainable. I think it's Quaker that is putting that requirement, Quaker's Oats putting that requirement on the Australian supply chain. For those not familiar with ISCC, it's based on 6 pillars of sustainability. First and foremost, and absolute paramount, is the protection of biodiverse and carbon-rich areas. So essentially, the grain cannot be produced on land which has been subject to any deforestation in the last 20 years or so. It needs to be produced with good agricultural practices, good internationally recognised agricultural practices, such as crop rotations, good agronomy. Safe working conditions for employees is principle number 3. Compliance with basic human rights and land rights and labour rights as prescribed by organisations such as the International Labour Organization, as well as our own domestic requirements in terms of worker occupational health and safety. Compliance with laws and international treaties that Australia may have signed up to. And the final principle is basically around good management practices and continuous good management practices on farm. Good management practices like good record keeping, making sure that the farm is operating in a truly sustainable manner, meaning that it's not just good for this generation, but it's also in a very solid position to be able to hand it on to the next generation of farmers in years to come. So I'll just skip on there. If we just have a look at the canola prospects for the current season, and firstly, I'll look at the global situation. So positively, we're seeing that oilseed consumption globally is rising. Excuse me. We're seeing both for food, as the population grows towards 9 and 10 billion in the next 20 and 30 years, we are seeing that ongoing demand for food, and oil is a key contributor to that equation to feed the global population. But as you'd also be very familiar, seeing a rapid increase in demand for biofuels, and the demand particularly for oilseed crops like canola to supply biodiesel. Canola obviously is, from an oil content and fatty acid profile, is a very healthy oil, recognised by heart associations around the world because of its low saturated fat level, high omega-3 levels and polyunsaturated levels, as a healthy oil for heart health. And globally, we see opportunities in many markets where there are less healthy oils and dietary issues, the opportunity for canola oil to be able to fulfill that market opportunity. Canola is grown sustainably, certainly in Australia, being able to leverage that opportunity globally. And of course, not to forget the canola protein aspect for, first and foremost, for animal feed and nutritious feedstock. And Mary's slides earlier on highlighted the benefit of canola meal in the dairy ration. And in due course, we'll see canola protein meal being fractionated for the human food industry. And there's a bit of that going on at the moment, none in Australia, but we will see that taking greater prominence in years to come. However, there are some black clouds on the horizon that we need to be careful of. As with any production, agricultural production, it's subject to climate change. The climate is changing. We're certainly seeing this in Australia in terms of more extreme weather events. And, we've just been through a very positive set of seasonal conditions with La Nina, which has been beneficial. But we're expecting to see more variation in conditions, and that obviously going to impact all of Australian grain production, but canola perhaps even more so in terms of ups and downs. The canola share of oils and fats is an important consideration. We have something like 70 or 80 million tonnes of canola produced globally. Between ourselves, the Canadians, the Ukrainians and the Europeans, we need to make sure that the canola and rapeseed maintains a strong share of the oils and fats markets, particularly against other less healthy fats. We do have a very high reliance globally on biodiesel. The risk there, of course, is that the biodiesel demand is driven through policy, European policy, United States policies, rather than the inherent demand that comes from demand like food, for example. So because it is driven by policies, it's subject to change with relatively short notice, and we're increasingly starting to see that out of Europe. And of course, we have got the issues around community sentiment around GM, which I think is actually, certainly in Australia, is becoming far less of an issue. And globally, I think COVID has helped people realise the importance that science can play in healthy living. It's sort of woken up the population to the benefits of science, and I think GM's been able to benefit from that, the sentiment around GM. But also we've got issues, particularly MRL issues not MRL issues, sorry, but regulatory issues around the ongoing use of chemicals such as glyphosate and others. So just a few things on the horizon there. In terms of the future 2023 crop, as I mentioned earlier, this is just being planted at the moment. For canola, that'll be coming to an end in the next week or so in most growing regions. And the prospects are looking very good. We have got very strong stored soil moisture. So even though we're coming out of La Nina into El Nino, which on this side of the Pacific means it's more likely to be drier and warmer, we have got very strong stored moisture below the ground for the crop. We are seeing strong share of canola in the rotations. We've had very strong production in the last few years, but nonetheless, despite that, we see continued strong presence of canola in that winter rotation of wheat, barley and canola. And we'd be expecting to see somewhere around around 5 to 6 million tonnes of production this year. Very early days, we're still even not sure the full area that's been sown, but there's certainly a lot of confidence around the Australian crop this year, and particularly based on the amount of moisture that's available despite the warmer conditions that are around the corner. So again, we certainly appreciate and value the trade that's happened with Mexico for canola over the last 18 months or so. That's been very strong, and it's great to be able to include Mexico as one of our leading customers, and certainly one of our leading growing customers for Australian canola. So thanks so much for your time this afternoon, and I'll now be handing to Dr. Tanya Oliver to carry on. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nick. And good afternoon to you all on Central American time, and good morning to our Australian participants. I'm Tanya Oliver and I'm the Australian Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry's Agriculture Counsellor located in Mexico City. We refer to our department as DAF, so I'll refer to us throughout this presentation as DAF. The region I cover includes Mexico, Colombia, Central American countries and the Caribbean islands. Today, I'm going to provide you with some information about how the Australian government supports, regulates and facilitates the export of Australian grains from Australia to our trading partners. DAF supports and regulates the Australian grains industry and has several roles in relation to the export of grain and plant products. DAF engages and supports industry to determine export market priorities, ensure industry members are export ready, and to identify what research and development needs are required to ensure Australian grains are competitive and reflect importing countries' requirements. DAF regulates and provides export certification for grain and plant products according to Australian legislation and each country's importing phytosanitary requirements. DAF also works to gain, maintain and improve market access and contribute to the development of international standards through the International Plant Protection Convention. DAF's grain and seed export program maintain a close working relationship with the Australian grain peak industry bodies. Both industry and government are committed to safe, pest-free movement of grains and plant products around the world. Australia's assurances to importing countries. So Australia is committed to our trading partners by ensuring that the goods being exported meet importing countries' phytosanitary requirements. This is mandated through Australian legislation, which specifies export requirements for many products and provides measures to ensure compliance with that importing country's requirements. The two pieces of Australian legislation are the Export Control Act of 2020 and the Export Control Rules of 2021. For grain exports, the relevant rules are called the Plant and Plant Product Rules. And these define how Australia regulates and certifies to grain and plant product exports, ensuring that every exported product meets the importing country's phytosanitary requirements. Australia has a three-tiered phytosanitary assessment process. Australia's requirements include establishment registration. So establishments that prepare goods for export must be registered with the Australian government for that purpose. This is also the location where official inspection of each commodity occurs. The packaging and transport units must be assessed for cleanliness before they are packed and or stuffed. And then the goods must be assessed to ensure they meet the importing country's requirements. Establishment registration is approved once certain criteria is met. The criteria includes the facility being fit for purpose so that regulatory staff can assess the goods and demonstrating appropriate management, hygiene, traceability and pest control programs are in place. The facility must be registered based on the commodity being exported. For canola, registration must be intended for inspecting and packing of both grain and seed. The establishment is required to present compliant goods for assessment that meet export requirements for their intended export destination. DAF has legislative capability to suspend or revoke registration if the facility is not up to standard. Assessment of transport units and export pathway. So for empty containers, there's assessed before packing against an official standards guide for inspections. If the required standard is not reached, containers are rejected and remedial action is ordered before goods can be loaded. With bulk vessels, all spaces that will carry goods are inspected and must be free from any contamination that may change the phytosanitary status of the goods. And once it's found to be satisfactory, a DAF inspection officer will then issue a permit to load. For the loading pathway, the entire pathway is assessed to ensure it is fit to carry goods without any chance of cross-contamination that would affect their phytosanitary status. Australian legislation prescribes 13 grains that must be assessed and inspected prior to receiving an export permit to leave Australia. Canola is included in those 13 grains. For the other plant products that are not included in the 13 prescribed, they will become prescribed if an importing country requires a phytosanitary certificate from the Australian government. It's a legal responsibility for all exporters and registered establishments to present goods that are compliant with Australia's export legislation and the importing country's phytosanitary requirements. Once the goods have been assessed and all requirements are met, the exporter is issued with an export permit and the phytosanitary certificate. These certificates are issued electronically to the exporter so that the exporter can provide on to the importing country as required. Thank you very much. Short presentation from me, but any questions on the department's role on grain exports can be directed through me at the Australian Embassy in Mexico City. My email address is there up on the screen. Or if you would prefer to contact DAF's grain export program directly, they have an email address that's there under mine. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions in the question time.
Great. Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you to all of our speakers. And yes, if we can get our panelists back on the screen, that would be fantastic, if we can have all the speakers on screen. As Mary said, we did have a number of questions that came in during the registration process, but of course there is the Q&A function there for you. So please feel free to put any additional questions that you might have into that Q&A function. And also, of course, if you want to participate in the webinar itself, you can also raise your hand and do that. But Tanya, I might go to you, given that you've just the last speaker on the screen, and we have had a couple of questions through, I guess, in relation to just around some of the sort of trade aspects, in particular in relation to the tariffs that might apply to imports of Australian canola into Mexico. So, are there any tariffs on canola seed or oil meal into Mexico? And also perhaps a quick update on free trade agreements that Australia may have with Mexico.
Great, thanks, Rosemary. In terms of the free trade agreement, there's a really good story to tell between Australia and Mexico with the recent comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, unfortunately named the CPTPP, but I believe in Latin America and in Mexico, that trade agreement is known as the TPAT, which is a lot easier to pronounce. But the good news there from a grains perspective is that Australian exports to Mexico of canola grain, grain, oil, crude product, is all a 0% tariff under that CPTPP.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tanya. And that's good news for Australian exporters and Mexican importers. Nick, I might come back to you. There was, I think you did answer this reasonably well during your presentation, but there was also a question around the demand for non-GM canola from Mexico. And again, I guess whether Australia's ability to meet customer choice in relation to that. Are you aware of whether the Mexican market is looking for non-GM specifically, and what's Australia's ability to supply non-GM demand, if that's the preference from the Mexican consumer?
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary. We certainly, as I mentioned, we have a very strong market choice framework. We call it the market choice framework, so that when a customer requires a particular GM or non-GM canola, we're able to provide that. We have very clear testing from delivery from the farm right through the value chain to ensure that if a customer's seeking non-GM, then that grain is at numerous points along the value chain to ensure that the non-GM canola is delivered accordingly, or if the market is seeking general canola, which is without any, excuse me, without specifying the to be non-GM, then that can also be supplied. So I think we have a very strong reputation. We've been supplying and segregating now for the last 13 or 14 years, and that's been extremely successful for the Australian industry to be able to demonstrate that capability.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, no, it certainly has been something that's stood the Australian canola industry, I guess, apart from some of the other sectors around the world. I might, which might be a question for perhaps Tanya, and then Pat might also like to make a comment from a commercial perspective. The question that's come in is assuming that Australian traders have already executed canola shipments to Mexico, and we know that that's the case. There's been several particularly active early part of this year. Have there been any regulatory issues such as any requirements around, I guess, SPS, pest or disease measures, or requirements from the Mexican Plant Health Agency? And then a subsequent follow-up question from the same questioner was around where Australia is in terms of participating in the ePhyto hub. But perhaps if we take the first question first around whether there's been any, whether Mexico has any specific SPS requirements of Australian exports to Mexico. So Tanya, you might like to lead, and then Pat might like to make a comment.
Sure, thanks, Rosemary. Yes, in terms of the current consignments that have been going between Australia and Mexico since 2022, mid-2022, we have certainly, in terms of communication with my department, the grain and seed exports area, they have certainly reported that Mexico is an excellent trading partner, and there's good communication there, and they enjoy a pretty good, smooth export process. Certainly, having said that, any issues that any exporters or importers that sort of arise and want to discuss and work through those, my office, my agriculture office at the Australian Embassy in Mexico City is very happy to discuss through any issues that may arise. So please do contact me if anything comes up. But as far as I'm aware, the trade is proceeding nicely and smoothly.
Pat, do you have any comments?
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary. I'm not aware of any particular issues that have arisen. I think from what I understand, the trade's gone pretty smoothly. So hopefully, as I was sort of saying in my area, hopefully a couple of cargoes come through and that then just builds and people can start to really understand the product that they're getting and work through that. So I think it's from what I'm aware of, it's gone quite smoothly. The other question about the ePhyto is, I mean, the simple update there is that Australia is not there yet. And the government are working on it, and we keep encouraging them to do that, but we haven't seen a resolution on that just yet.
Yeah, that's certainly been a issue that we've actively been pushing, and hopefully we will see that soon. While I've got you, Pat, I mean, I think you gave a really good presentation around the value of Australian grain. I guess as for canola, which is mostly going to be imported for use in a processing by the processing sector for meal and oil production, how do we apply that Australian system to give our customers a guarantee around the consistency of quality over time? I mean, Nick spoke a little bit about our variable climate. So what do we do? How do we utilise those systems and processes that you talked about to provide that consistency of quality to customers over time, which is obviously really important in a processing activity?
Yeah, the consistency is important. The first thing I say is that the customer and the exporter really need to communicate about their requirements and what they are and the consistency around that. And then also make sure that communication, if you like, is then specified in the contracts. and so that the contracts, in a sense, become evidence of the communication that's been had around that, and make sure that that's very clear. Then, in terms of managing that there, and really there can be variability from different regions. For example, the East Coast and the West Coast of Australia, there may be, because of different seasonal issues each year. So understanding where those cargoes are originating from, and then from the exporters and supply chain managers' point of view, is that that can be managed as well to once that understanding is there, that can be managed in the cargo accumulation process, and understanding what's required there for where that grain may come from, and then also from one season to the next, trying to not blending is not the right word, but to make sure that is monitored and managed from one season to the next, and maybe in some cases even mixing a bit of old season, new season stock together to try and streamline that change. But it's really the communication and making sure people understand the origination of it, and like I say, that at the end of the day, getting it all specified properly in commercial contracts.
Great, thanks. And maybe a follow-up question, Nick, for you. You did mention that the AOF does look at the quality of Australian canola on a seasonal basis. How does an importer in Mexico, or someone who's interested in understanding the quality of canola, get access to that quality of Australian information and be able to then track quality over time?
This publication is available on the AOF website. Now, the way it works is historical ones are available, readily available, and open for everybody. The most recent harvest one is usually for members only, but on request, if someone approaches me and our contact details are on the website, we can make that available to customers overseas.
Okay, great. And also, so I guess while I've got you there speaking, again, obviously the sustainability credentials of Australian canola is something that's very valuable in the world market. How does it apply to Mexican, South American customers, and how would they go about sourcing sustainable canola if that's what they would like to do from Australia?
Yep. Thanks, Rosemary. I think we're seeing this trend globally now. So it started in Europe, but it's certainly spreading around the world, and it's driven largely by the multinational food companies, food, feed, and beverage companies, who are requiring certified sustainable grain for their input, their agricultural inputs. And so that the ability of Australia to supply that is really executed through traders. So if the market in Mexico is seeking certified sustainable canola, that's just discussed as part of the negotiation in the deal. There is generally no specific price differential between certified sustainable and unsustainable, between certified sustainable and not certified. It's really just a point of point in the contract, and that specific grain would be then made available for the export market.
Thank you, and yes, apologies to our Mexican colleagues when I said South America there. I do know. I was really, I guess we've just been doing some of these webinars across South America, so I was using that as a generic. But yes, I do understand that we're not in South America in Mexico, so apologies to our Mexican colleagues there. I don't think I've seen any other questions in the Q&A, so I might just ask a couple of others. I guess Pat, one for you. I guess logistics. I guess particularly for COVID, I guess we saw a lot of pressure on logistics and availability, particularly of containers and other things. So do you have a comment around the sort of how the currently logistical routes for the export of grain to this route to Mexico, and are there any sort of issues that would be impacting on trade if there were demand for imports from Mexico?
I think, Rosemary, that from a shipping point of view out of Australia, you know, with our large production for the last couple of years, we've been exporting more grain out of Australia than we ever have before. So the supply chain has reacted positively to the increase in the capacity there. It's working out. It's actually quite interesting. I think it's sort of saying, put a problem in front of our supply chain and they solve it. And they've worked out how to improve their efficiency and export more grain out of there before. In terms of the global shipping issues and things that rose out of COVID, you know, there were issues around container availability, for example, out of Australia, and is not a problem that was unique to Australia. But from what we can see now is that is all starting to settle down, sort itself out. The markets solve a lot of problems around those areas in that reaction. So getting discussion with shipping lines around container availability into certain parts, I think is you know, again, something that talk to the exporters about that and have them work with the shipping lines. But and in terms of the bulk trade, you know, we've seen that go into Mexico quite readily. So that's really a function of the market, I think, to say when the prices align, then the trade will happen, I think is where we're at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Pat. And yeah, certainly it's been a major, very big export task from Australia over the last couple of years. So here's another question that's just come in through the chat. So where is the main source of Mexican canola presently? And what are the sort of future market opportunity for Australia? And Mary, do you want to perhaps take that one first, and then Nick or Pat might like to comment as well?
So where is the main source of Mexican canola presently?
I'm assuming that means where they're importing mostly their canola from today.
And that would be, yes, from Canada. And I think we've had a couple of people online today where Canada exports straight into Mexico, and then Mexico will also import from the US for their oil seeds and meal products as well. The future volumes of market opportunities for the Australian canola. Nick, I might just hand over to you on this one. I think this sits in your area.
So as I mentioned, we've seen some fundamental shifts in the oilseed complex over recent years, driven through the demand for biodiesel and canola for that. So we've seen particularly the Canadian flows changing significantly and diverting more and more canola to North America, and that's with Canada being historically the major supplier into Mexico. I think that's what's provided the opportunity for Australia to be able to supply into Mexico with the diversion of Canadian canola to the North American market.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And I know we are getting close to time. We'll wrap up shortly. But Mary, just in terms of AGIC as a resource for potential importers in Mexico, I mean, you talked a bit about the webinars and publications that you do. Do you want to just expand a little bit, perhaps, on some of the in-market activities and support that you can provide importers? And I guess particularly looking at if people might want to use Australian canola meal and how they might understand the differences of how to utilise and optimise Australian meal versus other destinations or origins.
Thanks, Rosemary. So a couple of things there. So AGIC will be looking to go to Mexico around October this year. That will be a bit of a barley focus. However, when you look at the technical market engagement activities in that canola feed space area or canola meal area, we've done a lot of work across other countries where we've brought in feed nutritionists and experts and looked at rations and done the calculations financially, including the transport and logistics, and run those technical one-on-one business-to-business meetings We have also demonstrated how we're using canola meal in our feed rations here and how it's increased productivity. So we'll be able to replicate that sort of work in market in Mexico, or virtually in Mexico if there's a big enough lead. I think Mexico is importing over 123,000 tons of canola so far. So we could work to support that if there's another greater interest in uptake. And I suppose that uptake could also come from who knows what's happening in other markets as well. So Australia could provide that fit in there. So we do the print media material, do the virtual updates, and we're looking to do the in-market workshop. And that in-market workshop's mainly around malting barley, but you never know whether it could extend into canola and other feed grains.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Mary. And Ricardo's kindly provided us a little bit of response to that previous question. So Mexico's canola imports have been almost entirely from Canada, with a few small quantities from the US, rapeseed from the EU, and obviously now Australia. So we hope, Ricardo, that next time we do one of these, that Australia is more significant in those imports coming through. I think we are up against time, and I can't see any more questions, but really appreciate all the questions that did come in. As Mary said, we had a lot in the registration, which was great, and obviously quite actively questions now. It's been appreciate the opportunity, Mary, from AGIC to be part of the webinar. I think it's been really, really great, and hopefully we'll see some more exports from Australia to Mexico. But I'll now pass over to Craig to close out the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll keep it really short because we are over time. Thanks to Mary in particular from AEGIC for organising this, and Mary, we look forward to having you over here later in the year. So yes, Australian Trade and Investment Commission. My colleague on the call is Agustin de Valle, so we work to very much on the commercial side, hand in hand with Tanya and her team here in the Mexican embassy here, the Australian embassy, should I say, in Mexico City. So we work in the commercial side, connecting Australian exporters to grain buyers here in Mexico, but also across the region. Augustine and I were in Guatemala in January, but we've got a broader mandate across Central America and the Caribbean. For us, of course, Mexico takes up the majority of our attention across different sectors. So we work in different sectors of food and ag. Grains is certainly a priority for us. You've mentioned today other categories that are going well, but we're closely watching canola and ready to support on this side with buyers. A few interesting themes today that are really hot, certainly La Nina and the weather patterns back in Australia. We've seen an extended drought across parts of Latin America, which has, of course, impacted some of our competitors, including in North America as well. Sustainability, and the last point that I found interesting was logistics, because as we talk to buyers over here about grains, of course, bulk shipment, clearly the most effective way, but the cost of shipping at the moment has been an issue. So it's an area for us to keep an eye on as we, from this side, seek to understand what we are and are not competitive in, and what the size of trade. So with that, thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Lovely. Thank you, Craig. Again, thank you, Tanya and Daph. Thanks, Australian Oilseeds Federation, Grain Trade Australia. Without your support and backing from GRDC and DAF and Australia, we wouldn't be able to present this information to you today. So we're really pleased that we've been able to talk about the sustainability, the industry stewardships, the Australian Grain Code of Practice, and present to you about how accurate the Australian grains information is. There is a poll now, so I'd just like to launch with the poll and a survey to receive your feedback. In the meantime, again, it was a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon, and we thank you for your time, and we look forward to further interactions and trade between Australia and Mexico. Adios and take care. And for those that are still online, I will send around a recording of this webinar, and it will be back up on the Australian web. on the AGIC web in a couple of days' time.
Great, thanks, Mary. Well done, and thanks to all.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks all. See you.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Derek, and our translators. Thanks, Rosemary and Pat. Good work, Nick.